in the 1980s, I moved up from Sheffield to here, to Newcastle upon Tyne, and I started to explore the landscape of Northumberland. And I found it fascinating because I moved up from the industrial triangle of Sheffield, Manchester and Stoke and the Derbyshire countryside into this huge empty space, empty of people, spaces, but this fabulous mosaic of habitats, which I was interested in exploring, but also interested in recording in as I developed field recording techniques for myself in the early and mid 80s. Northumberland was a great palette to go and record. And I began to become interested in some of the place names because I was exploring this place for the first time, and I came across really interesting names on the map, such as Bloody Bush, Hangman's Clough, Murder Rock. I was just fascinated by this because these were now tranquil, isolated environments. So I started to investigate how these place names had come about, and I came across the history of the place and right back to the time of the Border Reivers several hundred years ago. And these were lawless people who controlled the landscape because laws made in London or Edinburgh meant nothing to them. And these were cross-border people. They weren't English, they weren't Scottish, they moved across the borders, but they controlled the landscape. And they controlled the landscape by the sword. It was a violent place. And they collected rent, black rent from people. They collected blackmail. And if you were visited by the Border Reivers, you were bereaved. So they killed everybody and took everything. So their actions in these places were stained on the landscape. And I was also reading at the time the works of Alfred Watkins, the old straight track, and the idea of lines in the landscape and the memory of places and the spirit of places and whether or not events could haunt spaces. And I became convinced that some of the places I was going to embodied a spirit from another time. And I was interested to know if you could soak up, absorb that sonic environment through sound recordings. And then I came across the works of Thomas Lethbridge, who was an academic at Cambridge University. He ran the Museum of Antiquities in the 1930s and 40s. And he had a real interest in the sense and spirit of place. And I was very absorbed by that, his work, using a pendulum, dowsing over maps, and explaining why places appear to be haunted or occupied or have a spirit. And probably the simplest way I can try and explain this is something we've all experienced. Walk into a room or a house or a space, say you're house hunting or something like that, or you're looking for a house or a flat or apartment. You walk into somewhere and we instantly have this innate ability to sense an atmosphere in this place. And some people will walk into a place and feel warm and welcoming, and others will feel threatened by that space. And we have some ability, which is intangible, I think, to sense that. And I began to think the more time I spent outside in places like Northumberland, that was happening in open spaces as well, not just the built environment. It occurs in the built environment, but also in wild, open spaces, forests, woodlands, deserts. And as I began to travel more internationally with my work as a location sound recordist, I realized that actually this cross cultures. So when I was with the Wahiro Indians in Venezuela, or people in New Zealand, indigenous people in New Zealand, or North America, or Africa, or India, or Iceland, all over Scandinavia, there is this sense that there are spirits that haunt places, certain places. And I was fascinated to think about whether that could be captured with sound, and also not only captured but reproduced. And so it's something that still interests and engaged me. When I was exploring Northumberland, I then became interested in the sound of some of the woodlands, because there's a great collection of woodlands in Northumberland. There's a lot of planted coniferous forest, Kielder forest, but then there are these ancient woodland spaces, these quite small pocket habitats now, and I discovered Holystone Woodland, which had a remarkable history and sense of place. There's a a Christian shrine in the woods, but I'm certain that that supplanted a much more ancient pagan site, more likely a place that was inhabited by pagan spirits, dryads or naiads, water spirits or woodland spirits. And so I made a whole series of recordings in there, and the most powerful to me, the most poignant, was a time in autumn in a clearing in the woods where I left my microphone and walked away and made a long series of recordings. And just listening to, just even talking about it now, I don't have much hair, but that on the back of my neck is starting to sort of stand up. There's something in that space, in that place. And also nearby I used some contact microphones and inserted those into a wood ant's nest and tuned into this woodland in a very different way through the vibrations within this wood ant nest. So those two very different recordings in the same place really, to my ears anyway, and imagination really imparted this powerful sense of being inside a haunted space. Sometimes when I'm recording, I don't do much unattended recording. I try to listen, engage with the recording as I'm making it, but on some occasions my presence would affect what's happening there. So I walk away some distance away and observe and then listen back. And what's really interesting is sometimes I hear things that I hadn't heard from a distance, some very intimate sounds, but also some very powerful sounds, or it's part of the sense of place, and it's hard to describe because it's a sort of a physical representation in some of the sounds. Sometimes it's a low frequency, sometimes it's a presence. More often than not, it's down to the acoustics of the place as well, and that's something that we certainly pick up on in both the built environment and the natural world. After exploring the countryside of Newcastle, I turned my attention to the urban environment, the built environment. Newcastle's an ancient city. The river is a powerful arterial source, so I was drawn down to the river as many of us are, and particularly the Tyne Bridge, which most people will be able to identify the Tyne Bridge, and that wonderful arc, underneath that wonderful arc, which is just a few metres from where we're doing this now, had a strong influence on me because of the acoustic of that space and the activity in and around it. And I was recording for several projects and installation projects. So I spent time down here on the banks of the Tyne, on the north banks of the Tyne, in and around the Tyne Bridge. During the day, the soundscape here is smeared by traffic, and so it's very hard to tune into individual sounds. And there's this great low frequency blur in the acoustics, it's smeared by traffic noise. But come down here late at night, 10 o'clock, midnight, 2 a.m. Actually, quite often when the bars and clubs are sort of kicking off, the whole space changes acoustically. It becomes much more rich, much more interesting and engaging. So I came down to make a series of recordings at night under the Tyne Bridge, and got my microphones right underneath the arch, and so you hear the acoustics of the environment reflected off the building itself. And that coloration I found really powerful because it amplifies sounds from the distance, so it focuses sounds almost like in a way a parabolic reflector, which I sometimes use in sound recording does. But there was this bloom to the sound that I found really interesting and engaging on the exterior. And then I had the opportunity of working inside the North Tower of the Tyne Bridge with Attila Cesar, the vocalist, who did a scrying ceremony inside the bridge. And I was able to put my sound field microphone about 3 stories up, quite close to the underside of the roadway. So what you hear on that track is this remarkable booming sound of traffic over the expansion joints, but reverberating around this tall rectangular space, and this very strange acoustic within the city. What I like about both the recordings, the North Tower and under the Tyne Bridge, it's almost the same place, but one's interior and one's exterior, but they both seem to complement themselves in an interesting way. A few years ago, I was invited to create a piece for the Cultural Olympics here in Newcastle. So I made a journey in sound down the River Tyne from both the sources of the rivers, the North and South Tyne. But where it passes through Newcastle and Gateshead on the north side of the bank from the Baltic was an audio installation made of wooden instruments, a wooden synthesizer, and it was a tide mill. What fascinated me about that was I'd been recording the sound and the force of the water, and these sounds, the creaking floorboards and the blower, were mechanical wooden sounds, but derived from the ebb and flow of the tide. So it was this wonderful realization of the sounds of the river, which I've been working on, but through another medium, through shifting and shaping and forming wood to create these remarkable sounds in a place, again at night, which I found really had a real sort of focus to it, and that particular part of the river. Interestingly as well, I also discovered it's the place where the bodies of people that enter the river higher up usually end up being washed up. It's some strange corner. I don't know what the significance of that is, but staring down into this brown grey soup filled with mashed up vegetation that's come down the river, it had this other sense of poignance, looking down and thinking that unfortunately that's also where people end up.
What it is to you?
I was interested in recording some of the cathedral and church bells in the city a couple of years ago, and I was interested in the acoustics of them, and it's recording large bells, church bells. You know, the technique usually is to back off so you're out of the acoustic shadow of the building, but hear them directly. But what was fascinating with me, I discovered actually for the first time this narrow alleyway that leads to the cathedral, and in fact looking down the alleyway, one of the towers of the cathedral is framed, silhouetted against this alleyway. And I was just walking around exploring, looking for places, listening for places to record. And one Sunday afternoon, the bells suddenly kicked off, whether it was a rehearsal, I don't know, or some sort of performance. And I was inside the alleyway, and I got my soundfield microphone with me. So I captured this remarkable sense of travelling down the alleyway. This recording is actually made on the move as I moved down the alleyway towards the source of the sound. So the perspective and the reverberation and the coloration changes constantly. It's like a mini sound walk through that passage. It's very confined, and that really comes across well, I think, in the recording. Yeah, on my exploring the river, I mean, there was so much there. But one morning I went to this strange, abandoned, new factory area on the north bank of the Tyne, simply because I was interested in getting close at low tide to some of the wading birds which inhabit the mud banks. And I was stood there. I heard this dreamlike sense of metallic rhythms, this percussion that was on the acoustic horizon. And I really actually couldn't see much, but then I discovered there was a scrapyard across the river. And it really seemed to work, because hearing things, one of the things I enjoy about recording is capturing that sense of perspective. And by that I mean the relative distance between the source of the sound and the microphone. I think it's one of the most powerful things that we listen for in any piece of sound or music. And for me, standing there capturing these shifting, ebbing and flowing tones of this machinery in the scrapyard seemed to fit really well, staring down into this brown mud with sort of shopping trolleys, but curlews and redshank and purple sandpipers, which had migrated down from the Arctic tundra, but were using that exposed part of the mud on the River Tyne as a great sort of bird table. So there's a really good contrast in there, very fine, delicate sounds, but then this horizon of mechanical vibrations that I could hear in the distance.
Okay,
Station.
Move away. Yeah, move to the next station. And there's a lot. I mean, I would say the stations seem to feature as a theme.
Yeah, we could cover that. Yeah, yeah.
So I mean,
I could cover.
do you find them? You find there's something unique about the sonic atmosphere of the stations. I mean, there is, of course, there are always these incredible cacophonies, aren't they? But then late at night, they're something calmer.
When I was a teenager and I was exploring and investigating the creative potential of this wonderful reel-to-reel tape recorder, which my parents bought me when I was about 14, I discovered musique concrète. I probably heard it on Radio 3 or something like that. And I discovered the work of Pierre Schaeffer. And then, you know, as a teenager, I was blown away to think that this guy in 1948 made one of the first pieces of musique concrète by assembling a series of recordings he'd made in a railway station in Paris, and created this piece of music using his tape recorders, Etude au chemin de fer. And it really captured those sort of metal machine musical tones of a railway station, but everything in it, the timbres and the rhythms, yeah, like sort of banging metal from the building site. It really interested and engaged me, and it formed a lot of my creative output in the years after, both in Cabaret Voltaire and then in later on, and it still does now. I'm fascinated by the rhythms of railways, as many other people were. Kraftwerk with a great piece, Steve Reich, and it's something that's within us all. I think it's almost a bit like maybe people say the brass band music has that subliminal heartbeat message, and there's a sense of travel and perspective and acoustics, because quite often they're in these railway stations themselves. Certainly Newcastle Central Railway Station has this beautiful cathedral-like acoustic interrupted by the passage of trains. And so I'm continuing to work with railway sounds and rhythms. In fact, I'm working on a new album for Touch, which includes lots of those rhythms. And so I had the opportunity to make a radio documentary for Radio 4 about Newcastle Railway Station, because I spent so much time there, travelling up and down to London, waiting there, different times of day and night, and really soaking up the sounds of that space. And so I got permission, really sort of privileged access, in the middle of the night when the station was shut, and standing at the end of one of the empty platforms, and just recording sounds. I had no idea where they came from, but maybe the sounds of the city percolating under the canopy, or who knows what, you know, sounds coming up from the river or down the tracks, and then occasionally interrupted by a midnight goods train. But I was fascinated by that quietness in a place which normally has a huge volume of sound, and the residual effects of that. And then also latterly, one of the insulators that along the powered railway tracks, the electric track, had this fantastic snap, crackle and pop. So I thought, I've got to include that, this crackle of electricity that was going somewhere else, who knows, down a rail and out into the blackness. I've tried contact mics on all sorts of railway tracks and carriages and lines, and machinery, as well as air microphones, and I really love that sort of wonderful mix of inside and outside of objects and spaces. I think it tells us a lot as well. You hear a space in a very different way through its vibrations, through its mechanical vibrations. I mean, normally we're hearing each other now, I'm speaking to you now, but through the vibration of air pressure, but hearing that much more intimate vibration with something like a contact microphone or a hydrophone in water, you know, such as the Aegean Sea track, is really, it's electric, you know, interesting and engaging. And I think it strikes directly, like a lot of sound, into our imagination very quickly. I'm really interested in using hydrophones to record in fluids, and in particular our seas and oceans. We, you know, rather arrogantly think we live on planet Earth, and of course we don't. We live on planet Ocean. 70% of our world is occupied by the seas and the oceans, and we live on the relatively small dry bits in between. So everywhere I go, I take hydrophones with me, and I had a commission in Greece a couple of years ago to work in Elefsina, a town just outside of Athens. And in fact, it's Eleusis, it's one of the towns of the gods, and there's a remarkable temple there overlooking the Aegean Sea. So one of the first things I did in order to tune myself into the sound of that place was to go out on a boat and drop my hydrophones 10 meters into the Aegean Sea and start to hear, you know, the memories of the sea battles and the events that had happened there. Because in places like that, the sound doesn't change. It was just the same, maybe when the gods were riding the waves to when I was there in a small zodiac. But nevertheless, I mean, sound travels almost 5 times faster through seawater than just through air. So there's literally a depth to the sound which we rarely get the opportunity of hearing here, unless it's at night, which is when I choose to record quite often. And in the same place, I got to work in the temple of Eleusis, in particular one of the cave entrances, which is said to be the entrance to the underworld where Persephone inhabited. And so I managed to get 2 very small personal microphones like these. I often say there are much more interesting places to put these microphones other than on people. So I introduced these 2 personal mics down into the passage of the entrance to Hades, to the underworld.
Is it a sea cave?
No, it's a cave in the rock. We're very close to the Aegean Sea. So it's a cave that disappears into who knows where. What was really interesting, the day I put my microphones, introduced them into this, it's quite a small passageway. You couldn't get into, you couldn't crawl into it, but you can sort of see into the distance within it. Somebody had placed a pomegranate as an offering, a fresh pomegranate inside the entrance to this cave. So the thoughts and memory of the modern Greek people are still with the gods, I think.